Welcome back. You're watching Viewpoint, and we continue to talk about the G20 summit that came to a conclusion today. It was a huge historic success under the leadership of India. Prime Minister Modi also laid down that how India played a critical role in terms of forging an inclusive growth agenda and to ensure that all the partners of G20, all the member nations, come to a consensus despite stinging stark differences, especially on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. To talk about the various facets of that joint statement that has been put out, what has been achieved and what lies ahead, joining us on the broadcast is our panel and our special guests who join us this evening here on Viewpoint. We have Dr. Sangeeta Reddy, who's the chair of the G20 Empower India panel. We also have Mr. Rajat Dhar, who's the director of the Indian Investor Federation. Mr. Mohandas Pai, who's the chairperson of the Manipal Global Education, is also with us. Professor Brahmachalani, who's a strategic affairs expert, is joining us on the broadcast. We also have with us Professor Christopher Clary, who is the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Albany. Thank you all for joining us on the broadcast. Good evening to all of you. Dr. Reddy, coming to you first. The inclusive growth agenda has been highlighted by India. The inclusion of the Global South in this and the manner in which India has put forward the concerns of the smaller nations. How critical will India's role be for the times to come in shaping this agenda, in taking these issues forward?
So clearly this is a watershed moment, a historic moment in the history of the world and of G20 itself. Having started primarily as a body or a group of nations which came together for better economic progress, India has really raised the level of the conversation with the categorization of the strategy of, one world and moving on to say it's one future and one earth. It brought inclusivity, sustainability, and the fact that everyone should be part of this and everyone's voice is important. So I congratulate Prime Minister Modi, the Sherpa, the MEA, all the ministers and everybody who led the different initiatives. I believe it's important that leaders from all over the world understood that it's time for a new world order. I want to especially call out the fact that many of the initiatives, including, I think, the historic inclusion of Africa, the focus on the Green Energy Pact, the building of infrastructure to connect nations, the very, very critical focus on women-led development. And all these are significant parts of the dialogue. The fact that it was added into the leadership declaration and the fact of a working group focusing on cross-cutting initiatives to enhance women's participation in the formal workforce. All these are very significant and augur very well for the development of the world. So I'm extremely excited. Healthcare being my subject, I must also say that healthcare played an important part of the leadership declaration. And all the points which were deliberated of equitable healthcare, healthcare within the reach of everyone, cooperation on research, vaccines and drugs. And during the health summit, there was the historic launch by the minister of the health portal for medical value travel or people being able to access care in India because India is delivering world-class global outcomes at 1/10 of global prices. So all these are very significant, and I think overall it's been a fantastic year of India's presidency, and I'm excited for the results, the success, as well as the potential of the future impact.
Absolutely. Let me take that point forward with Mr. Rajat Dhar as well, the inclusive growth agenda. Mr. Dhar, two aspects I found critical, and please add to that if I'm missing a point there. The role of MSMEs and the leading role in innovation that perhaps private enterprises or the startups can play is a story that the entire developing world is very keenly looking forward to, and that resonated in that particular statement as well. When it comes to the role of the micro or the small industries, which are very pivotal in economies like India and for other developing nations as well, what kind of agenda, what kind of inclusive agenda can they really take forward?
Thank you. And while we're talking about the MSMEs or even micro and small scale, let me tell you, when we talk about the southern world, we had an experience where we did the Vietnam India conclave. And you would be surprised to know many smaller units based out of Mohali, Chandigarh, Kapurthala. And after COVID, they were trying to work towards getting their orders from China, and they were looking to set up their manufacturing facilities in Vietnam. So if we take that as an example, and we are saying that the whole African continent is getting opened, there is a huge scope for the Indian corporates, small and medium scale enterprises to enter into, because the market is absolutely huge. The
Sure.
only concern that we listen to or we can have is as far as the political instability goes there. If the political things are taken control of, I think it is one of the, and micro and small cap industries, trade associations, trade bodies can enable those companies to engage with the business association there. Like we had also engaged with the trade bodies from Ethiopia, for
Sure.
that matter, in the
Sure.
recent past. So that would be in terms, as far as the startups innovation is concerned, it has to be done at the two level. When we are talking about the fintech space, because financial inclusion, because also being one of the core
Yes.
fundamentals or the
Yes.
basis of this, fintech space in India is marred by, you can say, profitability issues. They are doing really good, but to come into a profitable level, they have a long gestation period. So we will
Yeah.
have to work where the established banks in India, like one of the head of from the ICICI banker, he told that it is a time when big Indian banks and fintech companies can combine together with MSMEs or micro enterprises, can create an ecosystem or a supply chain where the African market can be optimized.
Yeah. Yeah.
And therefore, the agenda of the G20 can be realized through that maneuver.
All right. I take that point forward with Mr. Mohandas Pai as well. Mr. Pai, before we talk about the much talked about corridor from India right up to the heart of the Western Europe and how critical and important it's going to be, financial inclusion and discipline is something that finds its place in that joint statement that has been put out. And more importantly, it talks about the role of regulators, central bank, ensuring that inflation in the developed and the developing economies is kept under control and check. When it comes to those critical areas in terms of having some kind of financial inclusion, what kind of steps have been taken? Do you see any tangible progress that has been made on that particular front, or a blueprint that has been put forward that can be followed in the times to come?
Well, I think India has put forward the concept of digital public goods. I think it's important for the world to understand that if you have digital monopolies in certain critical areas, you end up with big tech companies having the monopoly, which could squeeze out competition. And India's success in UPI, India's success in the use of Aadhaar to open 500 million accounts has been a success, has been a great role model for them to follow.
Yeah.
I think the G20 has also said that we need more inclusive climate finance. And for that, they have agreed to increase the capital of IMF and World Bank by $200 billion to remove capital constraints, which I think is very important. They also said that they're going to work on tax issues because they want to ensure that taxation comes to the host country. And today, digital tax is all over the place.
Sure.
So they're ensuring that taxation is also done on digital goods, which can be put into tax-exempt countries.
Yes.
And over the period of time, they made sure that tax havens have come down by getting in other instruments. They also spoke about debt forgiveness for Ghana, Zambia, and Ethiopia, which is very good because many of these countries are suffering from an excess of debt and needs debt forgiveness. So I think overall, there was something for society in the form of inclusion using technology, which India is a role model. There was the expansion of the global financial system and discussion on reforming the IMF and the World Bank. There has been progress on tax issues, ensuring that digital goods are taxed. And that's going to be a major issue because a large part of the value added is the form of digital goods. And likewise, debt forgiveness. I think in the financial area, there have been very much progress. And I think this is pretty good. But remember, all these have been works in progress. Many decisions have been taken because of India's push. India held 220 meetings, right?
Yes.
And India also explained the need to reform the global financial architecture. So I think all these things have been done, and there's certainly very good progress.
There's certainly very good progress. Professor Brahmachalani, I want to stay in this space and talking about in terms of trade, finance, fiscal growth and development, inclusive agenda, what can be achieved. particularly about cryptocurrency. This is, or the crypto assets as they are called in today's parlance. They have troubled various sovereign governments. There have been much talk about it. It has been argued that here in India, presently the regulation is very patchy. There's much more that needs to be done. There were union ministers who have spoken about this issue. But when it comes to crypto assets, there is a need for the regional platforms and to have some kind of multilateral arrangement or agreement as to how these assets are traded across border. In that respect, has there been significant progress that has been made?
I would like to add a note of caution.
Sure.
Because we have a very forward-looking 37-page consensus document that seeks to address all the pressing global challenges. On paper, the document looks very impressive. But we should not forget the G20 has a track record of not being able to implement promises made by its leaders. I think the New Delhi document has many pious commitments by member states. Implementing those commitments is going to be a challenge given the growing international divisiveness that we currently face. Some years ago, the G20 Summit agreed to reduce coal use, but since then, the use of coal has actually increased markedly across the world. So reaching a broad consensus on a host of promises is one thing.
Sure.
But implementing those promises, whether they are about crypto assets or about multilateral development banks or debt relief, putting them into practice will demand global unity, which is hard to come by today, given the widening international divisions.
So I take that note of caution with due respect, and I think we must talk about this facet as well, that how much of that is really going to be implemented. I'll dedicate the last few minutes of the debate on that, but I also want to bring in Professor Christopher Clary into the discussion and talk about various things that have been promised, how much of that really be implemented is for the times to come, as Professor Brahmachalani really pointed out. But Professor Clary, when it comes to financial inclusion, the role of MSMEs and the inclusion of the Global South, various countries, the global southern countries whose interests were not really at the center stage at these regional platforms have now been put. How significant is that inclusion? And from the point of view of economic aid, development, growth, sustainable growth for these lesser privileged countries, what kind of promise does G20 or the member nations really hold?
You know, ultimately, these sorts of summits are reflecting the interest of the states that are there. You know, India has done an incredible job of event management and diplomacy to get back to this day. But whether or not the poor countries of the world, we can call them the South or otherwise,
Sure,
benefit from these sorts of statements has very little to do with the summitry, to be honest. It has to do with how fearful the U.S. is about the competition with China, right? A lot of these pushes do reflect concerns in Europe and the United States about the equity and inclusion of the prior order. But realistically, it is about competing with China for influence in countries where U.S. and Western influence used to be assured.
yes.
And so, you know, building a new order where Japan and India have a very prominent seat at the table to help make sure that China doesn't gain inroads all over the world, that's the undercurrent of a lot of this summitry that allows for these ambitious packages to be joined.
Okay.
And if China continues to slip, then you may see less interest, honestly, from the West in competing in these places, because countries are not prone, India including India, to give away assets or money or expend resources unless they really have to, because they'd rather use those resources at home.
That's very candidly put, and you know, taking forward that note of caution as well that Professor Chalani was talking about, I want to take these points back to Mr. Rajat Dhar and Mr. Mohandas Pai. Mr. Dhar, A reality check on what can be really achieved. It's great that we have a consensus. Many thought that it was impossible to get a consensus or a joint statement. With the efforts of the Prime Minister, with the efforts of the diplomats, it has been achieved, and the member nations agreed to come forward. But let's talk about the trade corridor that has been much talked about. How significant it's going to be. Is it really about keeping a check on China, or one should see it as a road, as a trade road which is being developed, which does not have anything to do with the Belt and the Road Initiative? Rajadhar.
Okay. Let me be very frank and candid here, because the DNA of India has absolutely changed since 2014 when the new government came. And we should not be defensive even if we say that, yes, it is a counter to Belt and Road Initiative, either explicitly or implicitly. Yes, it is. And we should be very strict and candid with it, because this is the time we as Indians need to exert our dominance into a region. That is the reason why in Kashmir or Arunachal Pradesh, different different G20 events were held. Why it was done there? Initially, it was not done because of the same reasons. While obviously it will have economic benefits and all other things, it will be good for the infrastructure companies, the financial bodies, so on and so forth, trade, everything. But it will be more of a, you can say, it will be more of a communication. It is like a javelin piercing right through the heart of China when we are talking about this. So, it is like a statement, it's like a slogan. So, just getting your word across. And I think India is the only country in the whole Asia and Middle Eastern who has the guts to stand against China. And this is the time when we need to do that.
All right. Mr. Mohandas Pai, there is a note of caution that has come in from certain learned guests that we have with us on the broadcast. And there is indeed optimism that Rajat and the various other experts have spoken about. When it comes to the real implementation of the promises that have been made, what is the track record? And is there really evidence for us to be far more hopeful than what we have achieved in the future, considering that when you saw the joint statement was not a possibility, consensus was not a possibility, that has happened?
Well, the track record has been patchy, which is true, but it is a statement of intent of various countries. For example, take the new trade corridor. Saudi Arabia is going to be a great player there. Now, Prince Salman is in India. He'll be here tomorrow as a state guest. And his strategy is very clear to make sure that Saudi Arabia goes away from the hegemony of the United States. And instead of being driven by the United States, it has a more independent policy. Now, there is a fear that Saudi Arabia is shifting towards the Chinese, because you saw President Xi get Saudi Arabia and Iran for a talk. We have seen movement there. The Americans had the Abraham Accord too. Now, having the trade corridor through Saudi Arabia will improve trade with Saudi Arabia and make sure that the connection between the East, India and other countries, and Europe through a land route, and that is important. And that could be a bilateral meeting that will happen, which had the blessings of a multilateral forum like the G20. Because obviously Europe and the United States have blessed this, and I think that's going to be there. So what I would see is many things have happened, which has great impact on very many countries. It's up to those countries to use the consensus driven here in G20 to drive great advantage. For example, debt relief for Ethiopia, Ghana, and Zambia, right? Now that's been agreed. So they must take it forward and work it out with the IMF, and I think it'll work. Increase in the capital for IMF and World Bank has been in the works for long. Now that is extremely positive. The impact of technology like UPI, now this will be interesting for the countries in the developed world to reduce the cost of transferring money for small money, right? Because people pay a lot of money, and here is a tool that can slowly develop into a global system as an alternate to SWIFT. SWIFT is controlled by the West. You also have that the global South look at UPI and others as a tool, and digital public goods as a tool to ensure that the global digital monopolies do not dominate. So there are many things. It's up to individual nations and others to take this and push it forward. And to me, these are the interesting things that could really have an impact. But yeah, the record is very patchy in terms of its global impact, in terms of the consensus that has been developed. Consensus is very good. But how do you implement on the ground? That is, that's going to take time and is a bit patchy.
Professor Clary, do you share that sense of skepticism that yes, these are great promises that have been made, but when it comes to real geopolitics, they might not be implemented in the same spirit?
Sadly, countries are not known for altruism. So, what is different about the current moment? It's not just India's ability to pull off this sort of pageantry. It's the fact that India's economy is growing well. As long as India's economy is growing well, it's going to be courted by the global powers.
Yes.
And if the Indian economy starts to falter, as other economies have, this is a very challenging interest rate climate that makes Indian economic growth all the more remarkable. If India's economy starts to falter, it's going to struggle to continue to gain as much sort of ideational market share in the world. But this is an impressive moment. India is the fastest growing large economy on the planet. And India now has a clear seat at the global high table. That has been true for a long time. India has used to be a key representative of initially the non-aligned states, and then the developing world, and now India tries and wants to be a bridge between those countries of the global south as well as the established great powers. And India has good relations with all the great powers except for China, but China really matters. So we'll see how this all plays out.
All right, Professor Jilani, I want to take the last word from you. India's position at that high table on the global platform, has that been consolidated with the New Delhi summit?
Definitely. This was a high point in Indian diplomacy. The summit managed to achieve not just a joint communique, the New Delhi Declaration, the 37-page document that I mentioned. That was not the only achievement of this summit. The real value of any G20 summit lies in it serving as a venue for bilateral meetings on the margins. It is through these bilateral meetings that you manage to conclude deals. The real diplomacy in New Delhi was not in the summit hall. It was on the margins, where various world leaders were holding bilaterals. Modi held more than 15 bilateral meetings with various G20 leaders, but he did not hold a bilateral meeting with the Chinese premier in a snub to China. But he did hold very important bilateral meetings. As far as the US President Joe Biden is concerned, he played a low-key role at this summit, focusing his attention largely on further warming the relations with India.
Okay.
He has developed a personal rapport with Modi, and today the U.S.-India relationship looks very promising. We don't know what was agreed upon, apart from the fact that the two, along with Saudi Arabia and UAE, decided that they would work together on this transportation corridor to Europe via the Middle East. That by itself was an important accomplishment.
Sure. Thank you all for joining us on the broadcast, and thank you for sharing that views. But I want to take the last word from Dr. Sangeeta Reddy. Dr. Reddy, you are the chair of the G20 Empower India panel, so I must ask you, on the motto of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one world, one family, something that India has been talking about, how has India's soft power been so persuasive to get all the member nations on the same panel to build this consensus?
So clearly, I think you answered the entire positioning in your question itself. There is a great future for India, and I'm extremely happy that I think the future is not one which is dominated merely on the purchasing power parity or the size of the economy. Yes, we've become number 5 in terms of our GDP. We're moving to number 3.
Yes.
But those are not the factors which are getting highlighted. The factors getting highlighted are a new thought leadership. And that is true leadership and true power. It is the leadership of saying, let everyone in the world count. Let us start working today for the environment. A leadership declaration which said that we must together achieve our SDG goals. So I think it's critical things like this which is showing a new world order, a new methodology. And India clearly is saying this not just as a slogan, but a reflection of our cultural ethos. Like you mentioned, Vasudeva Kutumbakam.
Yes.
This is our cultural ethos. Carrying this cultural ethos with a voice and a confidence and a strategy to back it. So I think one of the busiest busiest areas in the Bharat Pavilion was the showcasing of the digital public goods,
Yes.
the RBI platform, the UPI. So what we're saying is that we have solutions. Come share them, come copy them, come buy from us if it's the vaccine. So these solutions come, access healthcare for your people by sending them for cost-effective care.
Yeah.
These are the type of things which are solutions for leaders who come from across the world, need to take back to their countries because they must create impact for their people. So we gave them solutions, we gave them thought leadership, and we gave them friendship and a hope for the future.
Absolutely. Dr. Reddy, it's always a pleasure to have you on the broadcast. And a big thank you to all our guests as well who were joining this evening, slipping into a very short break. But up next on the other side, we speak with the President and CEO of US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, Mukesh Aghi, on the strides India has made at the helm of G20. Stay tuned.